Planning Board meeting for February 1st, 2018. Welcome, everybody. We have a light agenda, but a number of things that we do need to hit this evening. And the first piece of business that we need to address is item number 2, which is approval of the minutes from January 4th, 2018. I know a number of you have submitted comments so far. Are there any other comments, additions, or would someone like to make a motion?
Yeah, I move we approve the January 4th, 2018 minutes.
It's been moved by Brian. Is there a second?
As amended by the board?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I'll second.
Seconded by Liz. Any further discussion? All in favor of Brian's motion, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? That passes unanimously. So the next item that we have on our agenda is public participation for matters that are not otherwise subject to a public hearing. We have just one public hearing this evening, and that is related to an annexation and initial zoning for the 832 Gapter Road property. So if you'd like to discuss that, we will have a separate conversation under that public hearing. But if you'd like to talk to us about anything else, preferably not about the Super Bowl this weekend, but anything else, this would be the time to do so. And we have 2 people signed up. If you would also like to join that queue, let Cindy know and fill out a quick form. But otherwise, the first person that we have lined up is Larry Parrish. And Larry has 3 minutes to address the board, and welcome.
Thank you. And I don't know if this is my comments are about the development of the Larry Miller project. Is this
This is the right time.
Great, thank you. First of all, I appreciate the opportunity to speak to this. I own a property immediately adjacent to the north of the property to be developed at 4770 Pearl Street, now referred to as Old Pearl. I think of it as the real Pearl. But anyway, first of all, I want to congratulate Larry Miller for their project. They've been great neighbors through the past. We've been neighbors for about 30 years. They've been wonderful. I bought a vehicle from them. I'm glad to see them thriving. I appreciate good businesses doing well and being able to stay in Boulder and hire people here and pay taxes here. So I'm in favor of the project, and I'm pleased with what they're doing. I have a few minor concerns. I had submitted them by telephone earlier, and I believe they're in your packet, from what I could tell. There was one new item that I wanted to bring up as well. I have 4 items. One is drainage. I want to assure that the historic drainage from our property, which drains to the southwest corner of our property, is still maintained and drains properly and doesn't somehow get dammed up. And I couldn't tell from the plans what the grades are exactly, but I want to make sure that it's not curbed up or dammed up, because that would be disastrous from my standpoint. Another item is a fence between our properties. There's a fence now that I believe is their fence, and it has a number of holes in it, and it's a security issue because we get a lot of vandals or homeless people trafficking back and forth. They've done a fair amount of damage and theft in my property, and I'm sure that that Larry Miller doesn't want them traipsing through their expensive inventory to cross my property for that purpose. Another one is trees. In the past, there have been actually there were volunteer bushes more than trees, but the root system has done a fair amount of damage to the pavement in my paved storage lot. And I love trees. I'm glad to see trees incorporated into it. I'm just hoping that there'll be trees that will not have a root system that goes parallel and damages my pavement further. And the last item is not really directly related to Larry Miller, but when you're leaving Pearl Street heading west and it dead ends at 47th Street, whether you're turning left or right, the traffic from the south, there's a big curve in the street there, and there's a sign right in the way, and you cannot see far enough to see where the traffic is coming. And the only effect of this development might be hopefully improve traffic, because I'm hoping their business thrives. So that would be more traffic and potentially more potential hazards. And the issue,
Go ahead and finish your thoughts.
thank you. The real issue is the sign that's there, and it's not their sign. It's for the building on the corner of 47th and Pearl, but the placement of the sign is such that it just blocks the view completely of anything coming from the south. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Great, thank you, Mr. Parrish. Next person signed up is Jerry Hurd, and if you can come up and address us, welcome.
Thank you for letting me speak tonight. Earlier this week, I emailed you an invitation to do an on-site visit at our property at 2010 Goss. The issue is that Mary Young came and visited on Monday night, and she actually encouraged me to also invite the planning board and the rest of the council to come and see this. We have an above the garage unit about 450 square feet. It can only be used as a studio or a workspace. We're not allowed to even have a bed in that area or let anyone sleep. And that's determined by the lot size. Our lot is a little too small to have a legal OAU. I think I've got the right terminology there. But that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to have it limited by the space. So if you come to, and actually we have used it that way. It was my photo studio for a while, and I was part of Open Studios, but times change and needs change. My husband and I live in the house in front of it, and it's 1,000 square feet. 1,000 square feet means we don't have a spare bedroom. So I have let family and friends use that space. It is currently being used by our son, who is looking for work at the moment. If you come to visit, what you will see is that cute little 1,000 square foot house that we live in, and we like living in that area because it allows us to walk everywhere, and we like that lifestyle. You'll see the garage, and you'll see the unit above the garage and how it sits on the lot and how it's currently being used. But what I think you will also see if you come is the neighborhood. Goss Grove is somewhat of a transient neighborhood. We currently are the only owner occupants on my block. There is none to the west of me. There are 2 to the east of me. Allowing OAUs in that neighborhood on slightly smaller lots certainly helps with my flexibility of being able to stay and live in that area. I think it would also maybe entice some other people to come and live in the Goss Grove area, because you have to be an owner occupant to actually have one of those units there. So I just wanted to come and in person extend that invitation to visit, and hope that you would do an on-site visit there, and seriously consider that as something that you do. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Hurd.
Do you mind if I
No, please do.
ask Jerry something? So somehow I'm off the email. I get some from the outside, so I'll get your address from Cindy, and I'd like to go over there.
Okay.
I've been by your house, and I think I've even been in it before.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
That would be great. I would appreciate you doing that. Okay. And
I'm
the
very
contact
interested.
information is in that email.
Perfect.
If you
Thank
finally
you.
get that. Okay.
And just so you know, one of the items on the agenda tonight is a discussion about council's prioritization of work plan items, of which OAUs and ADUs is one of that item. So that'll come back up later this evening.
And I would also note that the City Council is going to have a study session on February 27th at 6 p.m. about OAUs and ADUs and changes to the regulations to potentially make them easier to do.
Yeah, and I was told that lot size is on that.
It is.
On that agenda. Okay.
So
Thank you very much.
thank you, Ms. Hurd. Cindy, I take it somebody else may. Did you have a question or?
I wanted
point?
to follow up with Mr. Parrish's questions, but,
Yeah, why don't we come back to
Right,
that with
yeah.
call-ups?
okay.
Hey, Harmon. Let's see. Next up is Greg Flint. Welcome, Mr. Flint.
Good evening. My name's Greg Flint. I'm with the Larry H. Miller Group, and I just kind of want to introduce myself and be available for any questions for the first item on the agenda this evening. So just wanted to introduce myself and appreciate staff and all they've done for this application thus far. That's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you. Welcome, Mr. Flint.
I have a question.
Sure, go ahead.
The architect Mahoney out of Arizona, I believe.
Yes, that's correct.
Does this firm do work for the company on a regional basis, or how are they selected?
They do all of our projects currently. We've got projects in 7 states right now, and they do our architecture for every dealership remodel or new build that we do. So
I see you're pursuing a LEED certification.
we are looking at it, yes, definitely.
Okay.
So just, John, I wanted to, would it be proper for me to ask Mr. Flint a few questions regarding Mr. Parrish's?
Go ahead,
Okay.
yeah.
So you heard Mr. Parrish,
Sure,
and he
yes.
brought up 3 things. One, drainage, hoping it will be solved, or it won't put more water onto his property. The second, a fence, and the third, the tree roots. So could you comment on that?
Yeah, I can comment a little bit with what I know of the project. Obviously, we've submitted a grading and drainage plan. So I'd have to look into the specifics of exactly what that entails, and I'll talk to Mr. Parrish about that a little bit more, exactly what's happening there. On the plans, we also show that there will be a block wall along that north border of our property, which should help alleviate that fencing issue. And I apologize, and I can't remember what your third question was, because it's the third question, so.
You said that there were trees or kind of volunteer vegetation that were developing roots that had caused some problems with his asphalt in his storage area.
I wasn't aware of that, but it does look like there's probably trees over there on that north side, and we've certainly submitted a landscaping plan as well. I wouldn't know the specifics of what those proposals are, but we can definitely look at that and see what it is.
Okay, and then you're going to call Mr. Parrish?
Yeah, I'd love to talk with him a little bit more and
Okay.
get
So I
a
think
little bit more about that
The
information.
volunteer trees are going to be removed in lieu of the wall, from what I understand. With regard to drainage, the city's code wouldn't allow you to impact historic drainage patterns. As a matter of fact, I think I'd probably assert that the drainage in the area is going to be improved based on the proposed plan. Or anything else?
Great, thank you. Any other questions for Mr. Flint? Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Would anybody else like to address the board this evening for issues other than the GAPTR annexation? Seeing none, we'll move on to the 4th item on our agenda, which is a discussion of dispositions, call-ups and continuations, one of which has already been mentioned, which is the approval of a site review for the Toyota dealership at, I've got the case number, LUR 2016-00095 on 47th, but the address is, I think, not on here, as well as a call-up for the Rev subdivision at 3000 Pearl Parkway, 3000 Pearl Parkway, 2100 30th Street, 2150 30th Street, and 2120 Junction Place. Does anyone have questions, discussion, or a desire to call either of those up?
No.
I'll just comment that it sounds like staff heard Mr. Parrish's concerns, and can you just speak to that for a second? I mean, I know you, Charles, you already did, but just as part of this portion of the meeting, just reiterate that there's not going to be drainage issues or fencing issues or tree issues.
No, as I mentioned earlier, there'll be a block wall that's installed on the northern property line?
Welcome.
Hello, I'm Sloan Walbert. I'm the case manager in the planning department. So I'll just go through those. So in terms of the drainage patterns, they did submit a preliminary report, and they'll be required to do technical document review, or we'll look at the specifics. And as Charles said, they're required to maintain historic drainage patterns. Regarding the fence, Currently, they're proposing a block wall on that eastern property line. One caveat to that is they will have to get approval by Excel because there's a large Excel easement there for the transformer lines, transmission lines. And then regarding the trees, they did submit a landscape plan, and their proposal is to completely resurface the entire parking area and landscape it to our standards. So my understanding would be that all invasive or problem trees will be removed, and they'll be re-landscaping that entire area.
So
Go ahead.
the fence along the north property line, though, do you have information about that?
I do not in front of me,
Okay.
but we can look at that when we go into technical document review, make sure that there is a plan for that.
And then what, does Mr. Parrish have recourse if the drainage doesn't work out the way it's supposed to? What is his recourse if he ends up with a issue?
Well, so there's a code requirement. The subdivision agreement is also going to require that drainage remain the same. And then there's also a possibility for him personally to file a trespass action if that's not the case.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Sloan. Any other questions for Sloan?
Actually, Sloan, I have one question.
You should have gotten way faster.
This is probably, I just noticed on the criteria review that at one point it says the proposed project would add more pervious surface. And I just wanted to make sure that was true. Are we actually removing impervious, or did it?
I believe the reason it states that is because the building will be getting larger.
Okay.
But through the drainage report, they'll have to accommodate for any increase in pervious surface.
So that would actually be impervious, though, wouldn't it? Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
That's
I think the area where they're expanding is currently pavement, so I'm not sure exactly what the.
Okay.
But generally, any increase would have to be through they would address it through the drainage report.
Okay. That's fine. Okay. I want to make sure I understood.
Right.
Any other questions for Sloan?
Yeah, just
Go ahead.
one other thing. So can you talk a little bit, since there's going to be more impervious surface, can you talk a little bit about the water quality requirements? Because it's going to drain off into Goose Creek, I presume, and then Boulder Creek.
I mean, just generally, they have to follow our water quality standards, so they'll have to show that they can accommodate. They are proposing some rain gardens and swales to deal with it, but I don't think we know the specific calculations at this point.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Any other questions? Desire for call-up comments? Okay, seeing none. Thank you very much, Sloan and staff and Mr. Parrish and Mr. Flint. We will then move on to item number 5, which is a public hearing and planning board recommendation on a request for annexation and initial zoning of residential rural 2 for an approximately 30,840 square foot, 0.7 acre developed residential property located at 832 Gapter Road in Boulder County, LUR 2017-00077. And before we start the hearing, why don't we start with any disclosures that folks want or need to make? We'll start with you, David, and we'll just go down the line.
None here.
Harmon?
None here.
Liz?
None.
And I have none. Peter?
None, drove by it, that's it.
Okay, Crystal?
Yeah, site visit.
Okay, great. Brian?
Nothing.
Great, terrific. Well, great, thank you. We'll turn to staff for a staff presentation and then an opportunity for the applicant to present to the board, and then we'll have a public hearing if anybody from the general public would like to address this matter this evening.
Great. Thanks very much. Good evening, Chair, members of the board. I'll turn it over to Shannon Moeller to take you through the staff analysis.
All right. Good evening, Board.
Thank you.
So as you mentioned, tonight's first request is for an annexation initial zoning of a residential property at 832 Gapter. So I'll just provide a brief overview of the information in staff's memo, including the property and surrounding context, the proposed annexation and zoning, key issues, and staff's recommendation. As part of the public process, written notice was sent and notice was posted on the property. So all public notice requirements of the land use code have been met, and staff did not receive any public comments on this proposal. So as part of the annexation and initial zoning review process, Planning Board will make a recommendation tonight, which will go to City Council, who will make the final decision on the proposal. Moving on to the specific property, the proposal is located east of Gapter, west of Cherryvale, north of Baseline, and south of Dimmitt Drive. And the property is located in BVCP Planning Area 2, which is the area eligible for annexation. And it's surrounded on the north, west, and south by properties already within Boulder city limits. Here you can see an aerial photo of the site. The site's approximately 0.71 acres and contains an existing single-family home, some accessory structures, and has access to Gapter Road. And properties on all sides generally consist of single-family homes on similar-sized lots. This home is currently served by a well and a septic system. And here you can see some photos of the property and the surrounding areas, which consist of a mix of different styles of single-family detached homes. The Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan designates the site, as well as properties on all sides, as very low-density residential, which is described as single-family detached units at a density of 2 units per acre or less. And the applicant has proposed annexation with an initial zoning of RR2, Residential Rural 2, which is described as single-family detached residential dwelling units at low to very low residential densities. And properties to the northwest and south are also zoned RR2, and property to the east is outside city limits. Under the proposed zoning designation, no additional development potential exists on the property. Here you can see that the property is impacted by the 100-year floodplain of South Boulder Creek, so any changes or new structures on the property will be subject to the city's floodplain regulations and require approval of a floodplain development permit. Once annexed, the property would be subject to all city development standards and requirements. The applicant intends to replace the existing home with a new home in compliance with all current floodplain, energy code, and compatible development requirements upon annexation. So key issues for this proposal include compliance with state annexation statutes, consistency with annexation and other BVCP policies, and if the proposed zoning is appropriate for the property. So key issue 1 is if the annexation petition submitted by the applicant complies with state annexation statutes. Staff evaluated Colorado revised statutes beginning in section 3112-101, which are shown on this slide, and found the petition to comply with these state requirements. Key issue 2 is the proposal's consistency with city annexation and BVCP policies. Staff found the application to be consistent with many BVCP policies, in particular policy 1.16 annexation. So this proposal would allow the property to be annexed to allow city water and sewer service to be provided, and thus is consistent with 1.16A. And the result of this proposal would be the annexation of a substantially developed Area 2 property, and thus consistent with 1.16B. 1.16C, D, and E provide requirements for community benefit depending upon the amount of development potential. This property is just slightly larger than the minimum 30,000 square feet required per lot in the proposed zoning district, and thus has no additional subdivision or development potential. And finally, policy 1.16E encourages annexations that resolve a public health issue, which this proposal would resolve by allowing connection to city water and sewer services. And the third key issue is if the proposed initial zoning of RR2 is appropriate for the subject property. Staff found the proposed zoning is compatible with neighboring lots within the city and consistent with the underlying BVCP land use designation of very low density residential and therefore is an appropriate zoning district for the site. So therefore, staff found the proposal to be consistent with relevant state statutes and BVCP policies and recommends that the board adopt the motion listed in the memo and shown on the screen. And here again are those key issues for your discussion.
Thank you, Shannon. Appreciate it. Does anybody have questions for Shannon or anyone else on staff? Crystal?
Shannon, you said that there could be no additional residential development. I think in this zone, you can do an owner accessory dwelling unit if you meet some requirement, but so that's the little separate unit that can be 450 square feet. So would that be allowed?
Yeah, I believe that would be allowed if it meets those requirements. Under the city's annexation guidelines, we don't consider that to be development potential that you'd have to provide community benefit for.
And it's allowed by conditional use, basically by right.
Yeah.
Other questions? Go ahead, Harmon.
I seem to remember we had another annexation on the same block of Gapter within the last year. Isn't that true?
I think there's a property to the south that was recently annexed.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Any other questions for Shannon? Seeing none, welcome this evening to the planning board hearing. As the applicant, would you like to make a statement to the board?
No, I don't.
If you could come up to the microphone, that'd be terrific. Thank you.
If anybody had questions, I would be happy to answer them, but I don't really have anything to say.
Terrific. Welcome. Does anyone have questions for the applicant?
Just do your name and address probably. Cindy probably needs it for the record, so.
Sure. John Tossig, and one of our addresses is 832 Gapter Road, but we're currently at 6330 Clearview Road, which is only a couple blocks from there.
Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you, Mr. Tassig. With that, I think we'll bring it to public hearing, so thank you very much.
Thank you.
Is anyone signed up to address the board on this issue? Would anyone else like to address the board on this issue this evening? Seeing none, I'll close the public hearing and bring it back to the board for discussion and action. We have a recommendation from staff that this does comply with the Colorado statutes for annexation, that it's consistent with the city's annexation policies as well as the Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan, and that the zoning of RR2 is appropriate for the site. Does anybody have a different view or would like to amplify on that view? Harmon?
I'll just amplify. I agree with staff that the annexation petition complies with state statute. I agree with staff that it's consistent with our annexation policies and the comp plan. It's hard to argue that RR2 is appropriate when all the property around it is also zoned RR2. And in practical terms, it's going to result in the removal of non-compliant structures, the replacement with a modern building that meets energy codes, and it'll put funds in the coffers of our inclusionary housing program. So I'm going to support the project.
Terrific. Any other views or emotions?
Excuse me, Harmon, I don't think it's going to put any funds into the inclusionary housing unless they don't rebuild within 3 years. I think that that's how it's worded.
That's correct. Since there's already an existing dwelling unit on the site and they would just be replacing it, that's not something that we would require community benefit for. The only situation would be is if the house was demolished and not replaced within 3 years.
So it will put money into the coffers of our utilities when it connects to water and sewer. And it'll improve the groundwater regime by removing a septic system. How's that?
That's very good.
Thank you.
Peter?
I have a question as an educational point. Having driven by the property, as we saw in the pictures, so this is saying that if they don't, okay, so if they fix up the house as it is and remodel it, leave it as is and live in it, then no inclusionary housing is triggered. If they leave it vacant or however it is now, which looks close to vacant, then, and they wait out 3 years, then they are free of the obligation?
No, there's no obligation right now. So our standards say if you have an existing house and you annex and you decide to do a scrape, that does not trigger affordable housing, inclusionary housing requirements because you're not adding new units to the city. So it's only when you're adding like a new unit, subdividing and things like that, that you typically have to pay the inclusionary housing.
Thank you. That's
Just
what
unless you don't replace it within 3 years, that's that 3-year trigger. So if you just scraped it and left it for 5 years or 10 years or something like that, you would then be subject to inclusionary zoning.
Yes.
Or 3 years and 1 day.
No matter what you did then, even if you replaced it as a house?
Yeah.
Okay.
You lose your credit for the one dwelling unit you've got.
Okay.
That's a good way of putting it.
Use it or lose it.
Does it matter to us for this, any part of this, what they plan to do with it? Doesn't matter.
Not really.
I have a
Liz?
question, though. So if the development standards change, for example, if we changed our development in a floodplain kind of standards, those would apply to whatever they propose to do, right? They're not guaranteed replacement structure or anything like that. Is that right? All right, thank you.
Any other comments, different view from staff, or a motion?
I'm going to move.
Brian?
I'm going to go ahead and move that we recommend to City Council approval of the proposed annexation with initial zoning of residential rural 2, R2, pertaining to the request number LUR 2017-00077, incorporating this staff memorandum as findings of fact, subject to the recommended conditions of approval for the annexation as provided for in the annexation agreement in attachment C.
I'll second it.
Great, we have a motion from Brian, seconded by Crystal. Is there any other discussion?
I was
Crystal?
just going to say, after listening to a city council discussion on a previous annexation, actually it was the annexation revision, I would expect there might be some questions on the size of lots, the size of housing. Is there an opportunity to in the future to be able to subdivide, but looking at the RR2 zoning, as Harmon mentioned, I think the council would probably want to look at that in total for that zone or an area, or have a discussion.
Terrific. Any other comments on the motion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All in favor of the motion made by Brian, seconded by Crystal, in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? That passes unanimously. Congratulations. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
And that takes us to agenda item number 6, which is matters from the planning board, planning director, and city attorney. And we'll actually start with the planning director, who has 2 updates for us, starting with the city council retreat. Thank you, Charles and Shannon. Welcome, Jim.
Can I just ask a question?
Sure.
Did we have anything in our packet about this? I didn't notice.
No.
it. Okay.
No, I think we'll get it tonight.
Leslie.
It's time to start the comp plan.
Doing this on
Oh my,
seat sliding that way.
that's a good one.
I haven't figured that
Hey,
out.
Leslie, is it time to start the comp plan process again? Is that what we're? Just checking.
Thank you, Leslie.
One or
It's been 10 years already.
This.
Kind of feels like it.
That's not good.
Once it's time to throw it
Now you're at the little kids' table.
Yeah, that was funny.
It's like a nice town on the left. What town is that?
I was going to figure it out.
That is.
Should I
That mountain.
We're ready to roll.
proceed?
Yes.
Okay.
Welcome, Jim.
I'm Jim Robertson, Director of Planning, Housing, and Sustainability. I have a very brief presentation, and given that this meeting's kind of like a large train at full speed, I don't want to get in the way of that. So what my intention here is to speak briefly to you, kind of run through just a handful of slides quickly so as to open up as much time as possible as you want for questions and discussions. And of course, I'm happy to be interrupted as I go if you want me to pause on any one thing. I should note that in the audience, we have Leslie Ellis, Charles Farrow, and Kurt Fernhaber, all three of whom were also at the council retreat, and whose memories may be sharper about certain items of the retreat, or whose depth of knowledge for sure exceeds mine on particular areas. So when we get into questions and discussion, there may be occasions where they would be the best person to deal with questions or contribute to your discussion as you see fit. So with that, I will proceed forward. I wanted, before I got into sort of the substance of the work priorities as expressed by council, to just give you a little bit of some of the general aspects of the retreat. And actually, this was my first time ever at a council retreat. And I had the lucky honor of walking in as the Director of Planning, Housing, and Sustainability. Had never set foot in a retreat before. But one of the things I was impressed with was the really careful review and deference given to the input from a variety of boards and commissions, yours of course included. And they went through that very carefully. That was a major portion of the early part of the second day of the retreat. And I put here, these were my sort of summaries of some of the items that were in your letter to the City Council. And there were others, of course, and you'll see what the direction council went, and some of these issues are reflected in some of the priorities expressed by council. Another thing I wanted to make you aware of, and this may have direct relevance for the planning board and perhaps other boards and commissions as well, as in keeping with the work that's being done and will be done in the future in response to the work of the Public Participation Working Group, the council itself seems to be taking seriously the notion of what can be their role in improving public engagement in our city. I just put in here a couple of the ideas they discussed. I think it'll be up to them to sort of how they live into these. But they talked about doing some form of town hall meetings, and I think they mentioned, and I don't know that this is written in or etched in stone, perhaps quarterly sort of town hall meetings, whereby they would not have sort of a hard agenda in terms of actual items to be cleared from the agenda, but more of a open discussion and listening session. I think that's relevant. Actually, one of the items in your letter to council was, I think, wasn't expressly called town hall meetings, but I believe it had to do with sort of neighborhood forums or something like that. I can't remember the exact words that the planning board used. They also would like in the coming year or two to explore what can be done for the city of Austin to expand the ability of people to participate in meetings, including perhaps participation that would not require their physical presence at the meeting. So I bring that to your attention because that's something that they perhaps see in their future, and I think it could apply to other boards and commissions as well. And then one of the items they called out in terms of increasing the ability and the scope of public participation was perhaps an increased reliance on the work that's done, the hearings held, and the public participation that occurs at the board level. I don't think this was a fully fleshed out idea at the retreat, but the idea perhaps being, I won't say delegating, but really honoring the participation that occurs at the boards and then weighing that in relation to what's the appropriate way to participate at a council meeting. So those are just some quick general things I wanted to bring to your attention. So this is Planning and Housing Work Plan Pre-Retreat. In other words, this is a summary of the things we are already doing. Now, before I get into that, we have a phrase that we use around the office, the 80-20. You may or may not be familiar with that. The 80% being the ongoing work of both the planning and the housing work areas in our department. This is permit reviews, this is land use reviews, this is handling concept plans. I mean, you've seen some of it tonight with Shannon being up here. I don't know that it corresponds to exactly 80% of our total time, probably not too far from the mark. And one of the additional things that has been increasingly part of our workload and will be in the coming year is as we shift our sort of land use tracking system, application system for paying fees and so forth from the current system, which is both dated and now unsupported by its original manufacturer, to a new system called Energov. The go-live date for that is set for April, and we'll be entering, well, we are now flat out in a very busy period, taking a fair amount of staff time on that. And so I just wanted to mention the 80-20, and what we're going to be talking about really for the rest of at least my presentation is really more the 20. The sort of what you might call special initiatives, special projects. But I would be remiss in reflecting the work of our department if I didn't mention the 80. So these are some work areas that we are currently engaged in. I think you're quite familiar really with probably all of these 2 area plans, continued work on CU South, which right now primarily focuses on flood mitigation issues and so forth, but ultimately we'll have perhaps a greater land use component as we move towards potential annexation and things like that. As you know, and it came up just earlier this evening in your session, we are currently performing a body of work related to OAUs and ADUs, and then currently a body of work related to how to handle via the site review process requests for additional height and sort of what community benefits, specifically in the case of what we've been working on, affordable housing, are appropriate within that context. So now if I shift over and I just trying to give you a graphic picture of sort of existing and then new areas of work. 3 out of the 4 of those pretty much, emerged from the retreat untouched, if you will. So I won't belabor that at all. With regard to height and affordable housing, Council would like us to sort of expand the scope of that, and from now on, the new items, these sort of new priority items that are going to appear, I'll loop back to each of these and spend just a minute or 2 or a minute or so on each one to give you a little more information. So that's been shifted, the area focus, or the focus area there. Sub-community planning, a new body of work. A body of work associated with sort of the large lot, large home issue. You alluded to it just in the case you just had in terms of issues associated with large lots, large homes. Affordable housing linkage fee, you're familiar with this, and they want to move forward with that. And then I have a final 2, mobile home strategy and commercial to residential. They're treated a little different graphically because I think they will unfold a little different graphically. And specifically one of those, which I'll touch on, the commercial to what I've called just commercial to residential, may have particular implications for the planning board. So just a minute on sub-community planning. As I think in some ways the question that council wants us to ask is that, when a parcel seeks to broaden its entitlements, what are the community benefits that should be, that come in exchange of that? You as a board have spent a lot of time on this issue, so I know you're very familiar with it. Up until now, we've been looking at height and affordable housing. Now we'll be looking at perhaps a broad range of entitlements and a broad range of community benefits. Along with this, will come, the council wants us to use this as an occasion to take a look at revising, cleaning up, whatever sort of verb you want to use, the site review criteria in general and the way that works. The thing that will be necessary to allow this conversion from what we've been doing to the new work to happen is, as you well know, there's a July 2018 a sort of expiration date, if you will, on the current rules related to height and community benefit, council could just eliminate that expiration date and leave the current set of rules in place. They could choose to extend it. And because of the broader scope of work here now, we anticipate that instead of this being something we wrap up in July, this is going to take longer. Sub-community planning. You all are more familiar than I am with the notion of sub-community planning. We, in essence, sort of see it as we have sort of two deliverables in our sort of near-ish future, which is one, they would like us to spend some time to define sort of what a sub-community program over the years would look like. What are the kinds of things we will be looking at as we conduct sub-community planning? What issues are on the table? What issues aren't on the table? How might we go about doing it? How long do we think they'll take? Maybe recommendations on sequencing of sub-community plans and so forth, because we cannot, of course, do all of them at one time. So that's the first one, sort of creating and defining an overall program. The second one is they directed us in terms of their priority being, the first one we do being what's called the Central Boulder Sub-Community Plan. And by the way, this map is straight from, I think, the BVCP. Because we are already doing work in that area planning, civic area planning, the BCH site at Alpine Balsam, they were sort of bootstrapping, I don't know if that's the right word, this effort onto that. They would, the Broadway and Iris site, which is owned by the county and occupied by some county uses, they would like it to include that. That's technically not in the Central Boulder area. That's that red dot up at the top. Okay, so large lot, large home. The council, over the last weeks, and really at the retreat as well, expressed a fair amount of concern, especially for the areas of Boulder that were platted and subdivided with very large lots, tends to be sort of North Boulder and perhaps somewhat in East Boulder. Fairly large lots, you know, half acre, 2/3 acre, 3/4 acre lots, but which have homes on them that are relatively modest in size, maybe 1,000 to 1,800 square feet. They're seeing a proliferation of demolition of those small houses and construction of very large homes on them, which has raised some concerns of theirs. I put a question mark in terms of what really the issues are here, because I don't know that even within itself the council has reached consensus or full agreement on what both the problem statement and potential solutions or ways about going about addressing that problem statement are. Hence I put question marks. They've talked about things like potentially allowing or even incentivizing the subdivision of some of these large lots, so as to at least, you know, as it redevelops, get 2 dwelling units instead of 1 dwelling unit. Some council members have expressed concern just about the size of homes. I don't know where this will land. At the end, I'll talk a little bit about ways of moving forward on that. Affordable housing linkage fee. You're quite familiar with this. The city recently went through a process of setting linkage fees, but the council has expressed an interest in revisiting that. And it's currently scheduled, actually, on March 5th. The council will conduct a session regarding the affordable housing linkage fee. And the preparations are already underway within our department to get ready for that. At a minimum, once we have council direction as to the way they'd like to handle this, we, of course, would need to come back with first and second reading of the ordinance. And of course, that's relevant to you all, because if I'm not mistaken, that would need to come through you as well as a ordinance amending the code. I skipped over the mobile home strategy. That's only because that's a slightly less relevant to your board. As you know, the council also, and it's not reflected here, is interested in creating, and actually steps are already being taken to create a housing advisory board. With regard to the mobile home strategy, the council thought once that board is populated and operational, if you will, this might be an issue that they would want that board to undertake as sort of the chief venue for advancing the discussions on that. It doesn't come without, you know, personnel cost to us. I mean, we're going to be, the housing group will be the ones staffing that and perhaps providing some of the support for the work that they do. But I don't have further detail on that because it's a little bit less relevant to you. And then finally, the commercial to residential. You're familiar with this, and I called it commercial to residential. It actually embraces a couple different things that were mentioned in the BVCP action plan. One being revisiting the land use table to perhaps look at whether the allowed and conditional uses within the land use tables for the various zoning districts are achieving the purposes we would like for them to achieve. This is one where they specifically called out the planning board as perhaps the entity that could take a leading role over the coming year or beyond in really formulating recommendations and thoughts on this issue. And then, of course, also within that, what I call the commercial to residential would be, but this was a little bit lower sort of priority for them, taking a look at some of our light industrial areas and so forth, and looking at whether we, either through modifying sort of the use table associated with light industrial or rezonings or something else, enable a broader range of uses, including especially residential in some of these parts of town that are dominated by sort of light industrial uses. In terms of next steps, we're working furiously right now to prepare for going back to council on February 20th, at which we will report back to them with a sort of revised work plan and present that to them, a proposed revised work plan, and, you know, sort of under the spirit of, you know, did we get this right? Did we hear you correctly? A lot of these, all of the existing projects are quite well defined at this place. We have, you know, purpose statements, questions to be addressed, an engagement strategy, a schedule, and so forth. But for a lot of these new areas, we don't have that. And I don't know that the council even has reached a sort of meeting of the minds themselves as to what these bodies of work would be. So I would imagine we will be going back to some point with City Council and hopefully have the opportunity to share this with you as well, sort of a proposed work plan, including what is the purpose statement, what are the questions we're trying to answer, scope, schedule, board and commission involvement, and so forth. All of these are going to need further definition in that regard. I guess if you want to think of it as a sort of bad news, good news situation, the bad news is we have quite a bit of new initiative work on our plate. The good news is council was very vocal and supportive of the notion of us being able to bolster our resources, whether it's with additional personnel or dollars available for consultants and so forth. So we're really busy right now trying to figure out what are our needs in that regard, knowing what we know now, not knowing that we don't know the full picture, how these projects will unfold, so that we can go back to council and take them up on their generous offer of providing support. So with that, probably took a little longer than I thought, but it's a quick breeze through of what we heard.
Very little in there. So thank you. Appreciate it, Jim. Questions, comments, discussion? Crystal?
I have something. When you were talking about commercial to residential, the last time we really did that intention was on 28th Street on the east side of 28th, a lot of rezoning. And we did a critique as part of design excellence, or we did a tour as part of design excellence and looked at the buildings. But the one thing that I think we really missed the boat on, that I hope that we can address this time, is creating a sense of a community within that newly transitioning area. And if you walk behind those buildings, and it's just this maze of, dumpsters and really unattractive and missed opportunities. And so if planning board's going to play a role, I guess I'd like to make sure that we carve out some time to discuss that. So we've talked about this in the past, or City Council has in the past, and then Planning Board, they talked about area plan light. So you could take a broader view when you bring these zonings in, and then figure out the, how you make places and where they're going to be and what uses. So anyway, I just bring that up because I think it's great that council wants to involve this, and I guess I'd say I hope that we can accommodate kind of this bigger vision as we're looking at specific properties and zones, areas.
Other comments, questions? Harmon?
Well, to the extent that you can influence the time frame, I'd recommend and ask you to push up the ADU discussion, because unlike a lot of the other matters, there's currently a lot of state enforcement activity around ADUs that's affecting people. And making a decision on area planning, I mean, frankly, we've talked about area planning in the past. We're going to keep talking about it in the future. There may be a few people whose investment-backed expectations are going to be affected by what decisions we come up with, but the ADU and the OAU issue, the resolution of that will help a lot of people figure out which way they need to go with their own houses and with active enforcement files that the city has.
Yeah, we actually have some date certains for next steps on ADUs, OAUs. I don't have those at top of February 27th. Oh, it was mentioned in one of the earlier conversations. February 27th study session on OAUs, ADUs, and I think to be followed ultimately by sort of, depending on the direction we get there, sort of the drafting of the sort of ordinance that would enable the changes that flow from that project. So, and as I'm sure many of you, probably all of you know, there's been quite a bit of outreach involved on that issue already. Public open houses, survey, or not survey, sort of questionnaire, even sort of ADU stories that have been shared. So we have a pretty broad base of knowledge and engagement from which we're springing, and then that'll all, of course, be shared February 27th.
Thanks.
Great. Crystal?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure you'll hear something like this maybe from council about public engagement around this issue, because different areas have different issues. But what I found, I've gotten a number of emails from people, and the planning board has got some encouraging us. And I've looked up their address and looked up the zone and looked on our maps of where ADUs are and where OAUs are currently allowed. And people are saying, oh, please let me have an OAU, the owner accessory unit that's detached. And in fact, they can do that. Now, and I've even looked at their square footage on the assessor's map. So, and they do have the coverage on their lot. And so what I'd like to suggest is maybe some kind of an open house at some point. Can I currently do an ADU or an OAU? I mean, I know I've directed people to the planning department to walk in and ask that question, but I was thinking that maybe a public meeting and kind of go over it with some zoning and maps, and then people could kind of figure out, gee, I can do this right now.
I suspect in the process that has gone on to date, there have been some occasions where perhaps some light bulbs went off for people involved in terms of perhaps thinking that the rules either allowed or didn't allow one thing or another, and they've learned through the process. That's a great suggestion as we move forward as well, though, especially once the landscape has sort of stabilized as to what the set of rules are, if there are changes, and that would be, sounds like we would be serving a number of people's interests by doing that, yeah.
Yeah, and I think, can I do this now? I mean, rather than give us your ideas, it would be something, it would be like a, I don't know, like a mass, planner day visit to the planner of the day. I don't think you call them that anymore. They're all specialists now in this. But I just found that that's a big question. And the other thing, I know this isn't the discussion on ADUs and OAUs, but people, when they talk about, well, I have an illegal one, I want to make it legal. Well, if you have an illegal OAU that you got permitted as an office because you weren't in the right zone to do an OAU, that's not illegal. That was your intentional use of an accessory unit that you built, like above a garage and office, and you converted it illegally. And I think I've said this before, the fire department has a requirement that those units be sprinkled. And so you're going to have a big quandary with people that have done that and don't have a separate water line, I believe is required to provide for your fire suppression, the sprinkler, or you have to have some kind of a tank to satisfy that requirement and do your fire suppression off that. So I'm just saying there's some complicated situations that you're going to have to think through and how you're going to handle that. Because people are going to be pretty darn mad if they can't convert their unit that have been using for an office easily. So I hope that you involve the fire department in these discussions. And then you really have such a knowledgeable staff in all the little intricacies. And I'd love to see a list of things that they've seen over the years, especially zoning and Charles's staff. You know, little things that need to be clarified, that everybody who walks in the door with an architect or not asks these questions.
Other comments or questions on the work plan?
Just one on
Liz?
the, on the central area, is it a sub-community plan, area plan?
Well, we had a little bit of discussion at the retreat. Leslie may want to jump in and correct me when I inevitably get this wrong. But as I understand, if we call something a sub-community plan, it's sort of that at least connotes, if not fact out, means it corresponds with the boundaries identified in the Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan for the sub-communities. Council has directed us to look at that central Boulder area, but also include the area around and including the Broadway Iris site owned by the county. That would cause us to be looking at something other than the strictly the subcommunity as it's defined in the comprehensive plan. I don't know right now whether that means it's no longer really a subcommunity plan and it's now become an area plan or something like that. I don't know, Leslie, if you want to comment, or that's I think that's yet to be determined what exactly what name it's going to fly under.
Okay. And then it used to be a corridor plan, or that's what we've been dealing with, is sort of the corridor idea plus the Broadway hospital site. And so is the thinking that it would expand beyond outside of that corridor at all, except for the two sites at the...
That is the sort of both the geographic scope and then the sort of even the distribution of effort and inquiry within whatever the geographic scope is yet to be determined. We think really an important next step we need to have with City Council before we really embark on committing a lot of effort to the sub-community planning effort is probably some form of study session with them to talk about a lot of these issues.
Yeah, I mean, I can imagine that is, that's probably the most complicated sub-community that we have in the city, and then to tackle that huge stretch. I see nodding.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's ambitious, that's for sure.
And I'll just quickly offer, while we're on the subject of sub-community plan, I think the recent continued hollowing of Base Mar suggests to me that may need to be sooner on the list than I might have guessed a year or two ago when we were talking in the comp plan thing. I think that will need to be and will be an area of change sooner rather than later, so it makes sense to be thinking ahead about community engagement and some level of planning, even if it isn't a formal plan in that area. So, other comments about the work plan? David?
I did have one. I'll just first just echo what you just said on Basemar. I think, with all that wonderful work that was done on the underpass to kind of integrate it with the campus and everything, that there is a lot of opportunity there. And I was really surprised to read how badly businesses were affected. I think it was in the paper today. So, I was looking at the subdivision issue, and I noticed there were a lot of question marks up there. So maybe it's a little premature to ask this, but I was wondering, a lot of the lots, in the minimum lot sizes in a lot of these areas are in that half-acre to three-quarter-acre area. So are we looking? Is it in scope to look at relaxing the underlying zoning, or are we thinking of just making it easier to do subdivision within the current zoning? Or has that been asked yet?
I think we don't know the answer yet as to what's in or outside the scope.
Is there a study session on that scheduled that we know?
Not currently scheduled, no. But that's an area where obviously we need to spend time both coming up with sort of at least what a proposal would be of sort of scope and schedule and so forth, and share it with council and really sort of get a sense from them as to whether what we're thinking corresponds with, what their desires are in terms of policy change. But I think in terms of your specific question, I think we don't know the answer to that right now. I mean, the case you heard tonight on Gapter, as I recall, it's about a 38,000 square foot lot and but a 30,000 minimum square foot lot size. So your question says, would that be revisited? I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, I just know that I've spoken to people within residential estate zoning areas that have a lot that if you divided it, it would be just under the minimum lot size. And they would love to maybe divide the lot, live in a modest-sized home on one of the new lots and then be able to, do a retirement nest egg by building a house on the second lot, but it's just not allowed under the zoning.
Yeah.
And it's not something that I get the impression that a lot of neighbors would be upset about. But then, of course, any changes to zoning laws come with a lot of. I mean, I
think the thing we do know is council wants us to think along the lines of what makes good outcomes in their mind possible. So I think that kind of thing is potentially on the table for discussion. But I can't really at this point say that's outside the scope, that whereas something else is inside the scope.
Cool.
I'll just pile on David's comment there because it is one I was sort of thinking about making myself, but. As a part of that conversation, we really do have to look at what Crystal brought up in terms of utility servicing for those properties. We have to look at minimum lot frontage. We have to look at minimum lot size, all those kinds of things, open space controls on these lots. So the zoning has to be on the table because that's what keeps it from happening right now. It's the only thing that we actually have to talk about, really. And so, but it shouldn't be, I think, only focused on subdivision because that's probably the right tool for some of these properties. But in other places, it really probably makes more sense to do small pocket neighborhoods that are either condos or just simply multiple primary dwellings on single lots. So we're not looking at a full subdivision process and a lot of additional bureaucracy that goes along with that. If we want it to happen, we need to make it fairly easy for people to do it without it requiring, 17 hearings and all this work. So, but I think in this situation, it's one of these things where we could say pretty explicitly what we want as an outcome and ask for that. So it's more of a pattern book kind of approach as opposed to a sort of form-based code approach, right? As opposed to saying here's this sort of abstract Euclidean zoning that if you sort of ping-pong your way through all the little pegs, you eventually end up at magically the thing we've asked for without us expressing it. So I think there's a lot of typologies that would be really great in that environment, like little bungalow courts and little townhome subdivisions or duplexes or triplexes. I think there's a lot of really cool things that could happen in there. Yeah. I was going to also just say that it's since City Council raised the question of Planning Board taking a fairly active role in the use table piece. I don't want to start it right now, but we. Yes, you do. I've got it all done already. Yeah. No, I'm just totally thinking about that. But I do think maybe we could do a subcommittee of people who are interested in working on that would bring it back to the board And then that way we could make some progress on that. But I don't want to start it tonight or figure out who's on the committee, but I'd volunteer to be on it. But we have a chair who's going to be leaving soon, and I think that's something we'd want to talk about when we get the new person on, whoever that is.
That's probably right, and, but it probably does make sense to be proactive about some of these things, and maybe worth having a agenda soon after the new person comes on where you can really kind of try to stay ahead of some of these things and not be reactive. So with that, just a second, and then Crystal, other comments, really especially about the scope and priority, and other comments that will inform council's next touchback and the
Mr.
plan.
Chair, if I could, after I sort of breezed through my thing, I realized that one thing you didn't see, which was kind of intentional on my part, but I'm going to call it out that you didn't see. One thing you didn't see there is the element of time. In other words, what's the sort of schedule for these?
It's all now, right?
What's that?
It's all right now.
Yeah. So that's something we're working heavily on. This is essentially a 2-year work plan, the 2018, 2019. Of course, when we do go back to council in a handful of weeks, we will be trying to at least lay out at some schematic level some sort of certain things will be proceeding at this point, and others may pick up midway and extend beyond the end date of the first one and so forth. But I intentionally did not put that in there tonight because I think that's still very much a work in progress. So just wanted to acknowledge that.
Great, thank you, Jim. Crystal?
The discussion on the big lot, small lots, anybody who served as a liaison to landmarks will see what we saw. I think, did our whole board see that, or maybe it was just as a liaison, the demolition of a house because it was on a large lot. It was 800 square feet. The owners wanted to demo the lot because they couldn't use it for an OAU where they could have one in that zone because they just have to wall off the back part of it. So that triggered a discussion about giving Landmark the authority to recommend a subdivision or, to negotiate a subdivision and landmarking the small house and then, letting the property owner do what they had planned to do on the rest of the property. So I want to make sure that as you're talking about these, that we don't overlook the great suggestions that Landmarks made on preserving older houses.
Yeah. That topic received some specific discussion at the council retreat in terms of the relationship of incentivizing the preservation of either landmarked or potentially landmarked properties and using subdivision of a way of incentivizing that. So that topic did get some airtime at the retreat, and so it's on the radar screen. Yeah.
And then one other thing on the community benefit, and I'm sorry I didn't bring it up when we were talking about the code changes, but when we approved the Armory, we got a letter from John Wolf, who's an architect, that said you've calculated the density on I think it was the right-of-way that they did not dedicate, and where they were building sidewalks and the planting areas for the trees. And I think John's letter, I may be wrong, but he came up with it was 20 extra units that and I'll dig out the letter, it's part of the record, but 20 extra units that were a benefit. I mean, that's a huge property and that was a benefit to the applicant, the developer. And so my request would be, we look at that and decide what kind of community benefit could be attributed to that, because that is an increase. And the second thing is, when we get reports, when we get the staff report, I'd at least like that called out, how they figured their density. If it's on the property after their dedication of streets and sidewalks, even if the sidewalk area is in an easement, or if it's based on, this keeping it as an easement and calculating the density on that. I'd like to know, and I think we should consider what kind of community benefit we could derive from that, because it was a big eye-opener to see 20 units.
I thought you were saying that 20 additional units was the community benefit.
No,
No.
it
Additional
wasn't.
housing?
No, he bought out of all the, well, I guess you could look at it like that, but
housing
I
problem.
certainly didn't. I mean, they would pay linkage fees on that, but I don't consider that a benefit. It'd be great if they said half, like in an annexation, we're going to be affordable, but.
Well,
And
we
let's
don't know
keep
if that's true,
let's-
right?
Let's keep it at a level of generality. We're not getting into the actual
I know it's
agenda
true.
item tonight. That'll be something we'll get to when we get the detail. So other comments, and then we ought to move on to the housing board. Harmon?
So I just wanted to make two comments, and then I'll leave it. They're both on items that you did have discussion with council on. One is CU South, and then I just want to say one more thing about subdivision. So I just want to remind staff that the idea that planning board had in the CU South discussion during our comp plan process was to create a set of guiding principles that's pretty deeply thought through, and get them enshrined in the comp plan so that they would guide the annexation agreement. And I just wanted to point that out again, just to say that as council, this council looks at that annexation and what should be the componentry in that annexation agreement. The four bodies that approved this comprehensive plan update did it knowing full well what those guiding principles were, and those should continue to guide. And if they don't continue to guide, or if they're put aside in any way, there needs to be an adequate explanation for why that was, because they're not just planning board's guiding principles, they're city council's guiding principles, they are the planning commission's guiding principles, and they're the board of commissioners' guiding principles, since everybody approved it.
Harmon,
Yeah,
they're in here.
I know they're in there.
Oh, okay.
I'm not saying that somebody forgot to put it in here. I'm saying we did put it in here.
Okay.
And that as the board talks, as council talks about CU South, that those guiding principles were meant to, create some certainty as to what would be in the actual annexation agreement. So
Okay.
just putting that out there. And then the other piece is just to commend city council for drawing the connection between ADUs, especially OAUs, and subdivision. And really, I don't want to get into any kind of nitpicky analysis of what needs to change in the code. Charles and I had a 45-minute long conversation about a matter that I'm dealing with a client. And it really is very complicated, and Brian touched on some of this stuff in terms of like minimum lot width and frontage and stuff like that. But what I learned from this client is that for her, an OAU or a subdivided lot really meant the same thing, but that there were certain advantages to going one way or going the other. So if she were older and wanted to age in place and live in what would be the OAU, she might find herself in a position where she could take her one-time, tax-free sale, and she could sell the front lot, the big house, to a young family, and then have money to live on as a retirement. And in that respect, doing the subdivision would be more advantageous to her than doing the OAU, though to a passerby, the two configurations would look indistinguishable from each other. So putting those two in the same conversation was really a very foresightful thing for the council, and I hope that as staff looks at it, they will also realize that those two can go hand in hand.
Can I ask one question?
Sure.
So our letter to council talked about resilience and implementing some of the comp plan policies related to resilience. Did any of that come up in the retreat?
They specifically mentioned it when they were going through the board letters. I don't have much of a recollection of any sort of significant conversation about resilience at the retreat. I do know this has nothing to do with the council retreat, but the city's right now in kicking off the process of sort of examining its resilience program now, a couple years in, and evaluating sort of what it ought to look like moving into the future. So independent of council, just FYI, I think we have the opportunity to sort of think about that.
Would there be any land use or development standard kind of aspects to that?
I don't know the answer. This process of sort of revisiting sort of what do we want resilience to mean for our city, both in terms of sort of what it means abstractly, but what does it mean operationally? I think we're just kicking off that process.
I see.
But we'll have the opportunity to really, I think, take a very open-minded view of that.
Okay, thank you.
So I think we're going to be coming back to all of this more than once. All of you, probably more than I will. But
You'll be watching us, right?
I'm going to be right out there. So we also had, Jim, an update on the study session update and the Housing Advisory Board issues. Come on down.
I think my resident housing expert, fresh off his own localized housing experience of moving in the last few days, is going to address that.
That is an experience.
It's a workout, too.
Yeah,
Does he look tired?
A bit.
Yeah,
but relaxed too.
yeah.
Let's see. Good evening.
Good evening, Kurt.
Kurt Fernhauer, Deputy Director of Housing. A few days ago, we had a study session with City Council on Housing Advisory Board. So I'm just going to give you an update of what we presented there and also some of the feedback that we received from City Council. On December 4 of last year, City Council indicated to us they wanted to accelerate the work that we're doing on the Housing Advisory Board and to get it into place in such a way where it could go along with the normal process of putting the board members in place. So over the end of December and the beginning of January, we worked diligently on that. And the approach that we took was to look at these various areas, the charter, existing housing groups. We had previously done research on housing boards in different areas. We updated that information to look at how other communities were doing that. We received community feedback on 2 different open forums that we had, one in December, one in January. And then we drafted a purpose statement, functions of the board, the composition. And then at the study session, because it was on a sort of a tight schedule, we actually, before receiving their input, gave them a draft ordinance, which they also gave input on. So the city charter is a good place to start. So you can see that there's many existing boards that we looked at within the city. According to the charter, you can have 5 members with 5-year terms. So that was sort of the starting point in looking at this. So the current housing governance, this is what it looks like now, prior to having a housing advisory board. These are some of the boards and committees that give input into areas of housing that we deal with. Obviously, Planning Board, you're aware of your role in really advising policy that helps create affordable housing, and probably having a huge impact on our whole housing approach. The TRG has been in place for a long time. It's appointed by the city manager and really looks at the funding component of the affordable housing. It's a team of experts that sit on the TRG. The home consortium is a requirement under federal funding. And actually the Division of Housing for the City of Boulder, which a lot of people don't realize, actually oversees the home consortium for Boulder County and Broomfield, and we administer that. CDAC is also in place to look at funding for different support funding, like community gardens and that sort of thing. The Home Ownership Committee is probably the most diverse of the committees, and actually has affordable home ownership members on it as well. And they deal with policies around the home ownership program, of which there's about 850 units in the city. The Homeless Strategy Board, that's appointed by the commissioners, and I sit on that board, and that works on sort of the regional strategy for the homeless. And then, of course, the BHP commissioners. So that's sort of our current governance that is really involved with the direction of housing. So we looked at the different housing boards around the country. They're set up in a lot of different ways. Every community sort of does it their own way. We found that most of the housing boards have a majority, or if not all, of their members being sort of experts in the field. Those that don't would sometimes have a different role to play. So we had, again, we had two sort of open houses with the community. The first one was right before Christmas, and we had 12 people attend. The next one was in the first week in January. We had 35 attend that. And this is some of the feedback that we received from them. They really wanted the housing board, to have a clear purpose. They'd seen what boards do when they don't have a clear purpose, or what they don't do. And that it should really advance the housing efforts. The city has very clear housing goals. The Housing Advisory Board should help obtain those goals. And that they should focus on strategy, policies, and priorities. There was different opinions from the feedback that we received about the type of experience or knowledge that board members should have, whether it should have a lot of expertise or representation from the community. But there was a sense that people, regardless of that, need to be open-minded and creative. A word we heard quite a bit was innovative. They want the Housing Advisory Board to be a place where innovation can occur. And this was sort of the mix of perspectives that we had on both the approach side and the experience. So from the experience side, we heard people say the housing board should represent the seniors. Some said it should represent low-income individuals, represent mobile home communities, renters, homeowners, youth, middle-aged. But by and large, what City Council told us is, yes, we will have diversity on the housing board. And you can see from the approach standpoint that what we heard from the communities, they didn't want the housing board to have, an agenda or be driving in a particular direction, but really be open-minded to the various inputs from the community. These are the assumptions that we started with in drafting the ordinance. That the housing board would be an added resource to help move forward some of the housing ideas, a place for innovation, that it would focus on policy making. When it comes to funding, that it would make recommendations on sort of the direction of funding and the strategy of funding, but not funding of specific projects. So this is the purpose statement that we recommended to the City Council. I'll just go ahead and read this since you haven't seen it yet. A Housing Advisory Board will expand the city's capacity to develop and implement effective responses to Boulder's housing affordability challenges and accelerate progress toward city's housing goals. And then these are the functions that we recommended to City Council: advising on strategies and policies, recommending priorities around legislation, and later that was sort of focused on taking out the word legislation, but really looking at ordinances that we would have within the city. Again, here we have, innovative approaches to affordable housing. And looking at the impacts and policies, one of the things that we heard from City Council is the Housing Board should be a place where we can have community discussions, where people can come with their ideas and we can listen to them. So there's as you're aware, there's a regional housing strategy, and that this advisory board should give input to City Council on their advice and how to support the regional housing efforts. And then advising state and federal advocacy. So there's a need, I think, for coordination with the Housing Advisory Board, so it's not sitting in isolation. So the TRG, CDAC, and Home Ownership Committee, those are sort of institutionalized within the Division of Housing in our work, but there should be a connection to the Housing Advisory Board. So both informing and aligning in both directions. So potentially there would be someone from the TRG or CDAC who would attend the Housing Advisory Board, once a quarter, maybe give feedback on what they're working on. As well, Planning Board, there needs to be a connection with Planning Board. There was two different options that we gave here. One was that a Planning Board member would be a non-voting member of the Housing Advisory Board, and then the other option was the Housing Advisory Board to come occasionally and give an update to Planning Board. City Council was probably leaning towards the top one, to have someone from Planning Board that would attend the Housing Advisory Board meetings. I think they didn't think you worked hard enough and you needed another thing to do, so. So composition, what this slide indicates is what we recommended to City Council, that three of the members should have relevant professional experience in affordable housing, and 2 of the members should be at large. However, what we heard from City Council, they didn't necessarily support the idea of having that much focus on professional experience, and their approach was generally they would be looking at that with the applicants that they see or that applied, and that they would take an approach to ensure that all perspectives are represented and all expertise are represented on the board. And they didn't really want this 3 members driving those decisions. However, there was a preference for including a renter, and we included that in the draft ordinance as well. We received a lot of high percentage of feedback around this particular issue, that renters generally aren't proportionally represented on city boards. So this is the timeline. So we're going to be bringing back an ordinance on the 20th of February. The recruitment process has already begun for the Housing Board, so it's now in line with the recruitment of the other boards. In March, it'll be the second reading of the ordinance on March 5th. We'll be looking at how we're going to budget and staff the Housing Board and what the impacts will be on our division. And then the board will be appointed in April and begin, the board would begin in May or June, where we would probably have a couple months of orientation. And these are some of the things that were suggested for items for the work plan for this Housing Advisory Board. An orientation, and I think the orientation is actually going to take quite a bit of time. There's a lot of intricacies to housing, as you're well aware. The middle income down payment assistance approach is something that's on our work plan for this year, so they would look at that, look at how they could support the regional housing coordination. And then the mobile home strategy has certainly become sort of an elevated project for this year, and the Housing Advisory Board would really support that as well. So I'm going to stop there. I very quickly went through what was presented at the study session, and just hear what feedback you would have.
Thank you, Kurt.
Yep.
Comments, questions, feedback? Start with Liz, then Harmon.
Yeah, I was wondering, you showed all those housing boards in the beginning. Would this be able to take on any of the work that those boards do, or somehow, I don't know, reduce the number of housing boards out there? Or each of those other boards have such specific duties or whatever that they wouldn't become part of this?
Right. So the approach that we took is that we wouldn't be creating repetition. So the Housing Advisory Board wouldn't be doing the same thing that other existing governance structures are already doing. Some of those governance structures are, set up, through a requirement of HUD funding. Some are set up because it's a regional. Like the housing, the homeless is set up by the county commissioners. They each have their specific area that they focus on. The Housing Advisory Board is, I think, sort of a higher level function to really look at sort of the strategies and the policies and the direction.
I see. And is on those other boards, is the membership and minutes and all of that available to everyone? So people who are applying for the Housing Advisory Board could go through all of that material and get up to speed or whatever on some of the issues anyway, seems like. So all of those
Yes.
boards have minutes and
That's correct, yes.
memberships and all
Yeah.
that stuff's public. And
In fact, the TRG, I think it was yesterday, just updated the website of all the meetings that are happening for the year. Those are all public meetings. We have the first one coming up next week, and all the applicants and all their applications are online, so you can see all that as well.
I see. Okay, great.
Yep.
Thanks.
Harmon?
So Kurt, thanks for that thorough and informative presentation. I think until you got to the slide that said functions on the top, I was really a housing board skeptic.
Let's go back to that slide.
And I think that what I saw that was missing on the functions of the housing board, which I appreciate, is project review. And I'm understanding the role of the housing board to be really sort of a policy driver. And with that in mind, I think that a focus of the housing board should be actually lightening the load of staff, not creating another board to serve, but rather a board that serves and meets maybe quarterly with special meetings as necessary, and really focuses on these policies and ways of implementing them that would meet our goals and help us reach our goals. And if that's what the housing board's supposed to be, then I can really get behind it.
So from a function standpoint, you're correct. That is what we're focusing on. the city council doesn't share your opinion about the frequency of the meetings. So generally, the boards meet monthly. Their request is for the Housing Advisory Board, because it's such an emerging and important issue, that they meet more often than that, and have probably 4 extra meetings per year on top of the monthly meetings. We'll see how that goes. I don't think it's realistic to think that the Housing Advisory Board will lighten the load of staff. But I think it will be another place for us to engage with the community, and hopefully have more constructive dialogue, so when it does come to projects, which they're not reviewing, maybe those will go better.
Other comments, questions? Brian, then Crystal?
I had all kinds of comments and questions, and they all went away through the process of listening to your presentation, so that was really good. One question I had is just a pragmatic one. Is council talking about staggering the terms of people who are appointed this first round? So
Yes.
So we don't have 5
1
people
through
come.
5, yep.
Good, that makes a lot of sense. And then, because it's nice to have slow turnover as opposed to a whole board vacate all at once. I like the idea that it's got a balance of expertise and lay people on there. I think whether the balance is tipped one way or the other, I don't think is that important. That totally depends on who's the more compelling person on the board anyways, probably. I really like the idea that it's focused primarily on innovation, and that kept coming up. I think a lot of this input that came from the work groups and from council is really elegantly put together. So I think it's really feels good. I didn't read the ordinance yet, so I don't know what all's in there. I do like the idea of it being built of both renters and owners, so that populations and diversity, and maybe the appointment can be, if they don't get to write in there that it's a very specific mix of folks, maybe the diversity language can make it in there pretty strongly. I like the idea of having a planning board member sitting as an ex officio member on that board as well. I think that's working really well on the other boards. And it's kind of nice for us to just do the same thing we're doing on all these other boards and not have it be a totally different animal. So I think I started off a housing board skeptic and have landed as a housing board supporter. So you won me over. It's great.
Crystal?
I just want to say you all did a great job pulling together the study session for City Council, and I did watch it on TV, and it was evidenced by the discussion council had. I mean, I thought it was one of the best City Council discussions I've seen in a long time. It was really great. So thanks for laying all this out there for them, and then they had a framework to organize their ideas around. So I'm kind of with Brian on the innovative, that word innovation. And so I have a suggestion. During your orientation, there's going to be, I was thinking about co-housing, and there's going to be, someone asked me some questions, so I started researching it, went to Brian's website. Of course, it's got a wealth of information, but I saw that there's going to be a co-housing conference April 19th through the 21st, and I think it would be great to be able to offer that to them. And hopefully you have some funds to do that. If you don't, I won't go to the American Society of Landscape Architects conference. I'll throw that money in the pot. It's not really my money, but I just think it would be wonderful to have them start with something like co-housing, because I think people are going to be more and more interested, and it addresses like senior issues and families, a lot of things. So that's a suggestion for the orientation. And also, rather than trek out of state for all these conferences, APA, AIA, the American Institute of Architects, American Society of Landscape Architects, they all have good local Colorado conferences. And, you can take a look at the agenda. Some might be emphasizing housing. Urban Land Institute also will do that. So I if we're going to really talk about innovation, new ideas often come from other communities. So I would encourage that.
Thank you. Cool.
Yeah, and thanks for the good job, and thanks to the council for the good work that they did on this.
Peter, David, thoughts?
I like it.
Yeah, I have to agree that seeing the potential work plan items really helped me understand how, we in Planning Board are going to really benefit from hearing some interesting perspectives and have, this is the one that just really struck out when I was, I guess I read the Daily Camera article on it, was the mobile home strategy. I think that that's something that we don't get a chance to get involved with, but there's so many issues that have come up over the last few years on that. And to have a group kind of looking at that in more depth, I think would be really useful. We have an awful lot of mobile home dwellers here in Boulder, and they face a lot of issues that the rest of the community doesn't face. So I'd like to see some support for that. Looks good.
Thank you.
So I'll, guess last voice out of the 7 here, say I think it is important for the city to have a board to focus on this, because we don't have the luxury of being able to focus on this if we apply the 80-20 principle. We're focused on a lot of things for 75 to 80% of our time, and this does require the focus. That being said, I think the potential for this just to create a lot more work and a lot more expectation and then not be able to deliver on it, either because of staff constraints, council constraints, or other board constraints, is real. I'd be worried, I think, about trying to do too many things with the composition of the board, too many things on a mission, and not being able to deliver on those. And I think being able to really focus pretty hard to make sure there's delivery on that is big. And I think, I'm guessing you know that and you've raised all those issues, but as council is thinking about that, I think it's really important to have those focus, because I think this could easily turn into a lot of time, a lot of public engagement, and then a hard time delivering on all those pieces. And there's a balance between how much you want to do with a kind of a public-facing, community-wide discussion, which is critical and we need, versus the technical expertise and the technical body of knowledge that would be necessary to really innovate and really push the envelope on these things. And it's hard to do both of those at one time. So it may be some trimming of scope to focus on the things that this body could do best, would be best. And on that front, I think staggered terms are important, but it's worth thinking about a structure that would keep everybody on for at least a couple years, because I think there's going to be so much of a learning curve, both on the technical side and then engagement with the public. It would be a shame to have whoever has that 1-year slot, for example, if you just do a normal stagger, to invest all that in and then rotate them right off, and then having to start kind of cold and fresh with somebody.
Yeah, I agree with that.
So, I think just thinking about the kind of capturing and keeping knowledge and then balancing, you don't want to have an entrenched group that doesn't have change either. There's a balance on that too, but I think the fine tuning on that will be critical to how successful it'll be.
Well, to have that focus, we'll probably need a good chair.
Always true, right? So, that's always true.
We're wondering where you were going to go next.
I'm going home, see the family.
We already filled your application, actually. I don't know.
Did you?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
It's
With
filed.
the Mickey Mouse signature on there. Yeah, but it's a point well taken.
Yep.
Any other thoughts for Kurt? Thank you it's a lot of great work in there.
Thank you.
Terrific. Other matters from staff?
Was the conference thing resolved?
Thank you, Kurt.
Yeah, thanks.
Which conference thing?
We haven't decided who's going to the planning conference. Have we had that conversation yet? No.
The APA
APA
one?
Yeah.
Not me.
Is this the one in April?
It is.
Okay.
So now's probably,
21st to the 24th.
It happens to be the same weekend as the local co-housing
Yeah.
conference, so I will be going to that.
I will be in Europe, so I can offer that up to somebody else.
And I had suggested that, American Society of Landscape Architects has, of course, a yearly conference, and their emphasis is a lot more on urban design. And I just thought, if we look at the agenda, it's going to be in October. There might be, and it'll come out probably at the end of summer. And I'd like to put that on the table as having, people might be interested in that. But also, one other thing is being able to go to some of the local conferences that I mentioned as,
I've been getting involved in APA Colorado.
oh yeah, there's APA Colorado. I mentioned them all when I was talking about the housing board, and even the co-housing one. I'd actually prefer to go to that one this time around.
I do ULI and USGBC stuff locally.
I think that we can do that. I know that we have a budget. We're allowed to send board members to seminars, conferences.
Oh,
stuff.
totally.
And we are going to have a new member, so they will be able to go
Yeah.
as well.
Jim, are you going to have a budget for the housing board to go to conferences? I mean, at least local ones.
I haven't seen any explicit discussion of a budget for the Housing Advisory Board. I think my understanding is the same as Cindy's. I think we have I'm not sure our budget is specific to particular boards. I'm not sure.
My understanding, I'm going off of memory, it's $2,500, I think, but we are generous with that.
Yeah.
For the whole board?
Yeah.
A year, yeah.
I think
But we're generous with that, because like last time or time before, it was in New York, and that was way over budget because it was New York.
No, it was Peter's drinks.
Uber.
It was with Leslie and David on that night.
Oh, so it's Leslie's drinks is what you're saying?
Staff.
Well, anyway,
Toast to
back,
Cindy that night.
Yeah.
Well, of course.
It happens.
I think this is, let me interrupt you, I think it's a really good idea to have continuing education component to that.
Yeah.
Is
Good.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Colorado, NARA, Mountain Range, or Mountain Plains, NARA, there's some really good housing-specific local conferences, too.
Okay.
that would be great. If you could put together a list. I mean, I think since the focus of the housing board is housing, it'd be great to have a list of in-state, then you avoid all the, the hotels, the per diem, the flying.
Yeah.
And,
And housing is a largely regional.
yeah,
Yeah.
They'll
give
figure
that
out
a
what things
shot.
they want to go to.
Brian, that would be a huge help if you were able
I
to.
can do that.
Yeah.
That's Beefcake.
Because I'm sure Kurt and his team know a lot, but there are probably some that you know that they don't, so I appreciate that.
Yeah, I'll risk being redundant with what they already know, too. So
even the joys of Jaffa and those sorts of things, from a technical
yeah,
perspective.
it's the NARA ones.
Yeah. So just as a way forward, I know one of the questions was related to APA. Are there people who want to go to that?
I think I may be able to make it this year. And just so people know what's upcoming, I checked the conference schedule on the APA website, and so 18 is New Orleans and 19 is San Francisco, and 2020 is going to be in Houston.
So Harmon, you would like to go?
Yeah, I'll need to double check with the missus, but
And Peter, did you want to go?
I express interest.
Okay.
New person.
Well, I need to check with the new person as well. So,
I'd actually prefer to go to the ASLA one in the fall,
yeah.
Okay.
if anyone had interest.
So I've already been to one. I went to the Seattle one. If it turned out nobody wanted to go to this one, I would definitely want to go, but I've already been to one, so.
Yeah, I'm in the same boat. I've already been to one too, so
okay.
it would come down to schedules.
I'll see what they let us do.
Okay.
So on that front, just to kind of
Got that.
harmonize, not to play off your name, but since you haven't been to one, it probably makes sense to have you in a first slot and then maybe back up as a new member.
I haven't been to one. Yeah.
And so you should be on the list for ALSA along with the new member. And then to the
Or the
extent
co-house.
those don't fill in, then Peter or others, may be able to take some of that budget and slot.
Yes.
So, good. Anything else from the board?
No, sir.
No meeting next week, or 2 weeks.
2 weeks.
No meeting.
So there's no meeting in February after this one? And the study session that you were talking about, is that a city council study session?
Yes.
I see, okay.
John, I did have one issue that I wanted to bring up. It's not an issue, it's just a suggestion, is we got the public participation working group recommendations. And did we talk about maybe having a subcommittee meeting and making some recommendations on how planning board can implement that and maybe kind of tailor it to planning board? Because I'd like to do that.
I think it was a major thrust of our recommendation to council in the letter. And it sounds like the general principle was there, but not necessarily that direction. And my suggestion would be we should do it anyways as part of our own internal operations, because there are things we probably can do to keep doing a better job of engaging the public and that sort of thing. And so, and I think we can probably do that without necessarily creating a burden on staff or having to have a kind of particular direction from council. So I think it would make sense to do that. Again, probably my suggestion would be it would make sense to involve whoever the next chair would be. And so I would suggest setting up that subcommittee when you all make that decision and maybe have the new member. Because I think that'll be important to have the kind of buy-in, since a lot of what happens just from a public engagement and participation and that sort of thing, happens in the middle seat.
So there is a staff effort on the public engagement thing, and we'd want to definitely check in with Jean and Sarah, I think, are the ones who are running it. And I know since I live in the 311 Mapleton area, people keep asking me questions, and I just say, talk to staff. But I have sent some people to Jean and Sarah just because this is sort of a case study of how a site review might work with the public engagement, because all the other public engagement things, as we've talked about, have been on public projects and not on private projects. So anyway, there may be, before we just head off on our own direction, we might want to check and find out if they're learning anything from that interaction with the neighbors on that, and if they have any suggestions, what issues have come up, that kind of thing.
I think that makes sense, and I also think, consistent with what we suggest to council, it ought to be soup to nuts from the beginning to end of a kind of a cycle of a project or a matter, and some of that is purely on the staff side and engagement with the applicant before we even get involved or even can get involved under the ex parte rules. And so, I think that absolutely should involve that discussion with staff.
If I could just throw this in for your consideration, just FYI, at a upcoming date, which I don't have in my head, my calendar's back there, my backpack over there, but at a upcoming study session in the very near future, I don't know whether, Hallie, you remember the date, the council will be devoting the entire study session, all 3 hours, to the public participation topic. I believe they have settled on dividing it roughly into thirds. The first third will be actually a trainer from the International Association of Public Participation will be coming in and providing council a training. The second hour will be taking that information and dovetailing it with the public engagement framework that the city council, that the staff brought to city council, and council city in essence accepted in November. And then the third hour will be basically taking a case study. I'm not sure they've settled on what what the subject of the case study will be, and using that as a way of sort of operationalizing, if you will, the sort of some of the topics they've discussed in the previous 2 hours. That's coming up just in the next few weeks.
Great.
Cindy, do you happen to know the date of that? Do you have access?
I do not, no.
I apologize. Literally within the, it's measured in weeks.
Actually, I think I might have found it. There's a public participation training from 6 to 9 p.m. on.
That's it?
Yeah, on the 13th of February.
So, yes, right, coming up. Just wanted you to be aware of that. Of course, I mean, you sit at home in your pajamas or
Isn't that
sit here.
Will it be televised?
Yeah, it's a study session, so.
I've been thinking about public participation and planning, so I'll send out something to all of you. And some of them are just little things that we've talked about before, and some are a little bit bigger.
It's good to hear that stuff again.
And it may be worth, even before creating a subcommittee, just to have our own little either mini study session or agenda item that could capture thoughts from staff, thoughts from the board, thoughts from the public, maybe even invite some of the people on some of the particular projects that worked well or didn't work as well from a kind of a public engagement process. And we certainly had some where I think people felt they weren't heard, and some of that may have been within our control, and some of that may be subject to the limitations we have. But, you know, I think it's worth at least having a kind of broad conversation about that, and, you know, kind of feeding it into dialogue about, you know, what we might do to fit that into the particular context we have, where we have the quasi-judicial role on a lot of our matters that happen to be, other than the comp plan, probably the most contentious ones we've had the last few years. Other comments, suggestions, matters from board? If not, I'm going to call it and adjourn. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We're 10 minutes early. You predicted 8:15 on